Hey everyone, and welcome. Today, we are diving deep into a really important piece of legislation in India, the Arms Act of 1959. So you might be wondering, how does the country actually regulate firearms? I mean, who can own one? What are the rules? And what happens if you break them? Well, we're going to break all of that down. Let's get right into it.
All right, so here's our game plan. First, we're going to look at the big picture, the why behind the whole law. Then we'll get into the nitty-gritty of the language it uses, because that's super important. After that, we'll tackle the heart of the matter, licensing. We'll also cover the absolute no-go zones, the prohibitions, and wrap up with what happens when you cross the line. So, let's kick things off with the big idea.
Okay, first up, the framework of control. Before we get into all the details and the sections, we have to ask the basic question. Why does this law even exist? What's the point? Well, the whole idea was to create one single unified system to control weapons all across the country.
And you know what? The entire mission is hiding in plain sight, right in the very first line of the act itself. See that word, consolidate? That's the key. This wasn't just about making up new rules. It was about taking all the different scattered regulations that existed and bringing them all together under one roof, one powerful law, all for the sake of public safety.
So, if you're going to have one big law for everyone, you've got to make sure everyone is on the same page about what the words mean, right? To really get how this act works, we have to speak its language. The law is super specific with its definitions, and understanding them is everything.
The first thing you'll probably notice is just how incredibly broad the definition of arms is. We're not just talking about guns here. The law casts this really wide net that covers firearms, sure, but also things like swords, daggers, pretty much any deadly weapon you can think of that's designed to attack or defend.
And that brings us to a really crucial distinction within the law. A firearm is a very specific type of arm. It's one that uses an explosive force to shoot something out. So here's the main takeaway. All firearms are considered arms, but not all arms are firearms. This little hierarchy is so important because, as we'll see, the rules get a whole lot stricter the further up that chain you go.
And right at the very top of that hierarchy, there's this special, even more restricted category called prohibited arms. Now, these are the weapons the law sees as the most dangerous of all. We're talking about things like fully automatic machine guns or weapons that can fire tear gas. These are in a class of their own under the absolute tightest controls, as we're just about to find out.
Which brings us to the absolute heart of the Arms Act, the licensing system. And this is a big deal. In India, owning a firearm is not seen as a fundamental right. It's treated as a privilege, one that is granted by the government. And that entire privilege is managed through a mandatory license.
If you remember one thing, make it this sentence right here from Section 3. This is the golden rule of the whole act. It establishes the default setting for the entire country. Having a firearm is illegal, period. The only way it's not illegal is if you have gone through the official process and have been granted a license. Everything else in the law builds on top of this single idea.
So how do you actually get one of these licenses? Well, the law lays out a very clear three-step journey. First, you have to apply. Then, and this is a big step, the licensing authority has to get a detailed report about you from your local police station. Finally, based on that police report and their own checks, they make a formal, written decision. You either get the license or you don't. It's a serious process.
Okay, so let's say you go through that whole process and get approved. How many firearms can you legally own? Well, it used to be 3. But in 2019, an important amendment changed the law, and the new limit became this number, 2. And, this wasn't just some minor adjustment. It was a pretty big policy change designed to reduce the total number of firearms out there and make it easier to keep track of everything.
Now, even with this really strict licensing system, the Act draws some very clear, very hard red lines. There are certain groups of people who are completely forbidden from owning a firearm. No ifs, ands, or buts. So let's break down who exactly is on that list.
Section 9 of the Act is super direct about this. For starters, you're barred if you're under 21 years old. You're also out if you've been sentenced for a crime that involves violence or, quote, moral turpitude. And finally, you're prohibited if a court has ordered you to post a bond to keep the peace. These are non-negotiable disqualifiers.
And hey, remember those prohibited arms we talked about earlier? This is where that special category really matters. The law makes it completely illegal for an ordinary person to buy, own, or make them. The only way around this is to get special, direct, and explicit permission from the central government itself, and that is an incredibly high bar to clear.
Okay, so we've got the rules.
But let's be honest, rules are only as good as the way they're enforced, right? That brings us to our final section. What powers the authorities have to make sure people follow the act, and of course, the very serious consequences for those who don't.
The Act gives the authorities a lot of power here. For instance, a police officer can stop you and demand to see your license at any time. A magistrate can issue a warrant to search a property. They can also search cars or boats if they suspect illegal weapons are inside. And the control doesn't just stop when your license expires or gets taken away. At that point, you are legally required to hand over your weapon to the police or a licensed dealer right away. And if you break these rules, the penalties are severe, and they tell you a lot about the law's priorities. Just look at how the punishments are tiered. Simple possession without a license could land you in prison for up to 5 years. But if you're caught with one of those prohibited arms, the stakes get way higher. We're talking a minimum of 7 years. And if that prohibited weapon is used and causes a death, the sentence can be life in prison or even the death penalty. The law's message is crystal clear. The more dangerous the weapon, the more severe the punishment.
So, after going through all of that, what are the big takeaways? First, and most importantly, having a firearm in India is a strictly controlled privilege, not a right. Second, the law has this clear pyramid of definitions, from the broad category of arms to the more specific firearms, all the way up to the highly restricted prohibited arms. Third, getting a license isn't easy. It's a formal process that requires a police background check. And finally, this law has serious teeth, with harsh, escalating penalties to make sure it's followed.
And that really brings us to our final thought for the day. At its very core, the Arms Act is all about trying to find a balance. A balance between giving certain individuals permission to have a weapon and the much larger need to keep the general public safe. And the question it leaves us with is a really big one. For any society, how do you decide exactly where to draw that line? Thank you so much for joining us.